When my oncologist told me I had 6 months to live, my husband Adrian chose that exact moment to ask for a divorce so he could marry his 24-year-old assistant. Everyone thought I'd beg him to stay, that I'd collapse and plead for his mercy during my final months. He thought the same. What none of them expected was for me to call the most ruthless divorce attorney in Millbrook Heights and declare war on the man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Ashford, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the most devastating diagnosis isn't cancer. It's realizing you've been married to a monster. It started on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of crisp autumn day when the maple trees outside Riverside General Hospital looked like they were on fire. I remember thinking how beautiful they were as I sat in Dr. Martinez's office, waiting for test results that would change everything. Adrien was supposed to be there with me. We'd marked it on our calendar 3 weeks ago, right next to our wedding anniversary dinner reservation at Le Bernardin, the fancy French restaurant where he'd proposed 5 years earlier. But Adrien wasn't there. His secretary, a sweet elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, had called that morning with some excuse about an emergency client meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. In 5 years of marriage, Adrien had never missed a single one of my doctor's appointments. Not when I had my gallbladder removed, not during my bout with pneumonia last winter, not even for routine checkups. But somehow, the day we'd find out whether the lump in my breast was malignant, somehow that day, Adrian Blackstone, Millbrook's most successful real estate developer, simply couldn't spare 2 hours for his wife. I should have known then. I should have seen the signs that had been building for months. The late nights that stretched later and later. The hushed phone calls he'd take in his study, speaking in voices so soft I could barely hear the murmur through the walls. The way he'd started showering immediately when he came home, as if he needed to wash something off his skin. The gradual shift from I love you to love you too, to silence when I said goodnight. But when you're 32 years old and you find a lump in your breast during your morning shower, when you spend 3 weeks terrified that you might be dying, you cling to the illusion that your husband's distance is just stress. You tell yourself he's scared too. You convince yourself that he's just processing things differently, that men don't know how to handle medical scares the way women do. Dr. Martinez was gentle when she delivered the news. Stage 3, invasive ductal carcinoma. Aggressive, fast-moving, the kind that requires immediate action, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, the whole arsenal of treatments that would consume the next year of my life, assuming I had a year left to consume. The good news, she said, though her expression suggested there wasn't much good about any of this, is that we caught it before it spread to your lymph nodes extensively. With aggressive treatments starting immediately, your 5-year survival rate is around 70%. 70%. Those words echoed in my head as I drove home to our sprawling Tudor house in Millbrook Heights, the house Adrien had bought us as a wedding gift, the house where we'd planned to raise the children we'd been trying for since our honeymoon. 70% meant 30% didn't make it. 30% became a statistic, a cautionary tale, a name on a headstone. I needed to tell Adrien immediately. We'd need to discuss treatment options, insurance coverage, how to handle his business while I underwent chemotherapy. We'd need to talk about the possibility that I might not survive this, about what that would mean for us, for our future, for all the dreams we'd built together. I found him in his study, just as I expected. What I didn't expect was to hear him laughing, actually laughing, while talking to someone on the phone. Through the crack in the door, I could see him leaning back in his leather chair, completely relaxed, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. God, I miss you too, he was saying, his voice warm and intimate, in a way that made my stomach drop. I know, I hate these long days apart. But soon, sweetheart, very soon, everything will be different. I stood frozen in the hallway, cancer diagnosis burning in my chest like a physical weight, listening to my husband make promises to another woman. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd just learned I might be dying, and in that same moment, I discovered that my marriage was already dead. That night, Adrian came to bed late. slipping under the covers like nothing had changed. When I tried to tell him about the diagnosis, he barely looked up from his phone. "Cancer?" he said absently, still scrolling. That's rough, Vic. We'll figure it out." That's rough. 5 years of marriage, and my potential death sentence warranted the same response he'd give to a fender bender. 3 days later, everything exploded. Adrian didn't even have the decency to wait until after my first oncology consultation. He cornered me in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared coffee every morning for half a decade, and delivered the blow that would change everything. "Victoria, I think we need to talk about our future," he began, and I knew from his tone, that careful, practiced voice he used with difficult clients, that my world was about to crumble even further. What came next would test every assumption I'd ever had about love, loyalty, and what happens when the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the one you need protection from. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation that destroyed my marriage lasted exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. I know because I was staring at the kitchen clock behind Adrian's head, watching the hands move while my world imploded in real time. "Victoria, I want a divorce," Adrien said, his voice as casual as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "I've already spoken to my attorney, and we can make this simple. Clean. You'll be well taken care of, obviously." I set down my coffee cup so carefully you'd think it was made of spun glass. Outside our kitchen window, Mrs. Henderson was walking her golden retriever, the same routine she'd followed every morning for the 3 years we'd lived in this house. Everything looked normal, peaceful, exactly as it had been 5 minutes ago when I still believed my husband loved me. "Clean," I repeated, testing the word. "You want our marriage to be clean." "I know the timing isn't ideal," he continued, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair, the same nervous gesture he'd had since college, "with your diagnosis. But Victoria, we haven't been happy for a long time. You have to admit that." I stared at him, this man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years, and tried to process what I was hearing. 3 days ago, I'd learned I had cancer. 70% chance of survival, assuming I got immediate treatment. And now my husband, the man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health, was asking for a divorce because the timing was inconvenient for his affair. "Your attorney," I said slowly. "You've already spoken to your attorney." "Victoria, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder?" The word came out as a laugh, sharp and brittle. "Adrian, I have cancer. Stage 3 breast cancer. I need surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. I might die. And you think I'm making this hard for you?" For just a moment. One brief, flickering moment. Something that might have been guilt crossed his face, but then his jaw tightened, and I watched him transform into the cold, calculating businessman who'd built a real estate empire by bulldozing anyone who stood in his way. "Look, I'll make sure you have the best medical care money can buy," he said. "The treatments, the specialists, whatever you need. But Victoria, I can't pretend anymore. I haven't been happy in this marriage for years." Years. I felt something crystallizing inside me, something hard and sharp and dangerous. "How many years, Adrian?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That's not the point." "How many years?" Since about 18 months after we got married." 4 years. 4 years of lying next to me every night, pretending to love me. Going through the motions while planning his escape. 4 years of birthday gifts and anniversary dinners and vacation photos. All of it performed for an audience of one, me, the wife who was too stupid to see she was starring in a one-woman show. "And let me guess," I continued, my voice getting quieter and more dangerous with each word. "You found someone who does make you happy. Someone young and fresh and uncomplicated by things like cancer." Adrian's silence was answer enough. "What's her name?" "Victoria, that's not." "What is her name?" "Natasha," he said finally. Natasha Sterling, she's my assistant. Of course she was. Because Adrian Blackstone, for all his talk about being innovative and forward-thinking, was exactly that predictable. The successful older man, the young beautiful assistant, the wife who'd become inconvenient. It was such a cliché, it would have been funny if it weren't destroying my life. How long? I asked. Does it matter? How long, Adrian? 8 months, 8 months, which meant he'd been sleeping with Natasha Sterling for 2 months, before I found the lump in my breast. He'd been planning his exit strategy while I was lying awake at night, terrified that my body was betraying me, never realizing that my husband already had. So when I was going through those weeks of terror, waiting for test results, thinking I might be dying, you were with her. Victoria, please. You're being dramatic. Dramatic. The word hit me like a physical blow. I had cancer, my husband was leaving me for his secretary, and I was being dramatic. That's when something inside me snapped. Not broke. Snapped. Like a steel cable under too much pressure, whipping back with enough force to cut through anything in its path. I stood up slowly, deliberately, and looked at Adrian Blackstone. Really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. His perfectly pressed shirt, his expensive watch, his manicured nails. The man who'd built his fortune by never backing down from a fight, who'd taught me that in business, you either destroyed your opponents or they destroyed you. He'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that because I was sick, because I was scared, because I was facing the fight of my life, I would be weak. He'd forgotten who he married. I smiled at him then, a smile so cold it made him take a step backward. You're absolutely right, Adrian, I said softly. This should be clean. Simple. No unnecessary complications. Relief flickered across his face. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Oh, I'm being very reasonable, I assured him. In fact, I think we should call our attorneys right now. Get this process started immediately. Our attorneys. Well, you've already called yours, I said, still smiling that ice-cold smile. Now I need to call mine. And that's when Adrian Blackstone realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd declared war on a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He just didn't know it yet. After Adrian left for his office that morning, probably to celebrate his freedom with Natasha, I found myself standing in our walk-in closet, staring at a shoebox I hadn't opened in 2 years. Inside were photographs, ticket stubs, and handwritten notes from our early days together. Evidence of a love story I'd thought was real. I pulled out a picture from our second date, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember now. We looked so young, so impossibly happy. Adrian's arm was wrapped around me outside the old Starlight Cinema in downtown Millbrook, where we'd just watched some terrible horror movie that had us both jumping and clutching each other like teenagers. That was October 2018, 3 months after we'd met at the Riverside Chamber of Commerce mixer. I'd been working as a marketing coordinator for Henderson & Associates, a small but prestigious accounting firm. Adrien had just purchased his 3rd commercial property and was expanding Blackstone development into luxury residential projects. He was confident, ambitious, and completely different from the safe, predictable men I usually dated. I remember he spilled red wine on my white blouse that night at the mixer, and instead of just apologizing, he'd insisted on buying me an entirely new outfit from the boutique next door. Not because he was showing off his money, though he had plenty, but because he was genuinely mortified and wanted to make it right. We spent 2 hours in that little shop while I tried on different blouses, with Adrien offering commentary like he was a professional stylist. That blue one brings out your eyes, he'd said, leaning against the dressing room door. But the green one makes you look like you could conquer the world. I'd chosen the green one, of course. And when we left the shop, Adrien had looked at me with such intensity that I'd felt something shift in my chest. I want to take you to dinner tomorrow night, he'd said. Somewhere fancy. Somewhere worthy of that blouse. Our first real date was at Chez Laurent, a French restaurant that had been Millbrook's crown jewel for 30 years. Adrien had reserved the corner table by the window, the one that overlooked the river. He'd arrived early to make sure the lighting was perfect, had pre-ordered champagne, and somehow managed to have them arrange white roses, my favorite flowers, as the centerpiece. "How did you know about the roses?" I'd asked, genuinely curious. "I asked your assistant what flowers you liked," he'd admitted, looking almost embarrassed. "I called Henderson and Associates 3 times before I got the courage to ask." That night, we talked until the restaurant closed around us. Adrian told me about growing up in foster care, about how he'd worked construction jobs through college to pay his tuition, about his dream of building homes that families could actually afford. I told him about my parents, who'd died in a car accident my sophomore year, about how I'd put myself through marketing school by working at the campus coffee shop, about my plan to eventually start my own consulting firm. "You're going to be incredible," he'd said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I can see it in your eyes. You have this fire, this determination. You're going to change the world." The way he looked at me that night, like I was something precious, something worth protecting, I'd never felt anything like it before. And when he walked me to my car and kissed me for the first time under the streetlight in the restaurant parking lot, I'd known with absolute certainty that this man was going to be important in my life. Our courtship was like something from a romantic movie. Adrian would show up at my office with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery, just because he'd been thinking about me. He'd send flowers on random Wednesdays with notes that said things like, "Because you made me smile when I woke up this morning," or "Thank you for existing." 3 months into our relationship, I got food poisoning from a questionable sushi restaurant downtown. I was violently ill for 2 days, couldn't keep anything down, and felt like I was dying. Adrien showed up at my apartment with homemade soup, actually homemade, not store-bought, and spent the entire weekend taking care of me. He held my hair back when I was sick, brought me ice chips when I couldn't handle water, and never once complained about missing his golf tournament or the networking event he'd been planning to attend. "This is disgusting," I'd groaned from my bathroom floor, where I was basically living at that point. "You shouldn't have to see me like this." "Victoria," he'd said, sitting down beside me and stroking my hair, "I want to see you like this. I want to see you at your worst, at your most vulnerable, because that's when you need someone the most, and I want to be that someone for you." When I was finally feeling human again, I'd found him asleep in the chair beside my bed, still wearing the clothes he'd arrived in 2 days earlier. He'd stayed the entire time, hadn't left even to go home and shower. That's when I knew I was falling in love with him. Our first Christmas together, Adrian had surprised me with a trip to Vermont. He'd rented a cabin in the mountains, complete with a fireplace and enough snow to make everything look like a postcard. But the real surprise wasn't the cabin. It was what he'd planned for Christmas morning. I'd woken up to find him already awake, watching me with that soft smile he used to have, the one that made his whole face light up. "Merry Christmas, beautiful," he'd whispered, kissing my forehead. He'd made breakfast, pancakes shaped like snowflakes, because he'd remembered me mentioning that my mother used to do that when I was little. And then he'd handed me a small wrapped box that made my heart skip a beat. Inside wasn't a ring. We'd only been dating 8 months, but something even more meaningful. It was a key, attached to a keychain shaped like a tiny house. "It's not ready yet," he'd said, suddenly nervous in a way I'd never seen before. "But I bought land on Maple Street, the lot overlooking the park. I'm going to build us a house, Victoria. Our house. Somewhere we can build a life together." I'd cried then, actually cried, because no one had ever planned a future with me before. No one had ever looked at me and seen forever. The house took 18 months to build, and Adrien involved me in every decision. We spent weekends picking out tile and paint colors, arguing good-naturedly about kitchen layouts and bedroom configurations. We planned the garden together, choosing plants that would bloom in different seasons so there would always be color in our yard. "This will be the kids' playroom," Adrien had said, standing in what would become our family room. "And upstairs we'll have 3 bedrooms, 1 for us and 2 for the babies we're going to have." "Babies, plural?" I'd laughed. "You've got this all figured out, don't you?" "I've got us figured out," he'd said, pulling me into his arms. I know exactly what our life is going to look like, Victoria, and it's going to be beautiful. Our wedding was small but perfect, held in the garden of our new house with just our closest friends and the few family members we each had left. Adrian had written his own vows, and when he'd looked into my eyes and promised to love me, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, for richer or poorer, until death do us part, I'd believed every word. "You are my best friend, my greatest love, and my perfect partner," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to protect you, to support your dreams, to be your safe harbor in every storm. I promise to love you more each day than I did the day before, and to never, ever take for granted the gift of being your husband." I'd felt like the luckiest woman in the world that day. Now, sitting in our closet with these photographs scattered around me, I wondered when exactly that man had disappeared. When had the Adrien who made me snowflake pancakes been replaced by the stranger who'd asked for a divorce while I was facing cancer? But as I put the photos back in the box, I realized something important. That love hadn't been fake, no matter what Adrien claimed now. For at least the first 2 years of our marriage, he had loved me, which meant he was capable of love. He'd just chosen to stop. The first attorney I called hung up on me. "Mrs. Blackstone," Gerald Hoffman had said in his condescending tone, "I'm afraid there might be a conflict of interest here. Your husband has already retained our services for his divorce proceedings." Of course he had. Adrien had gone to Hoffman, Burke & Associates, the most prestigious family law firm in Millbrook Heights, the same firm that had handled his business contracts for years. He'd locked me out of the best legal representation in town before I'd even known we were getting divorced. Nin. The second attorney, Maria Santos, was more direct. "Mrs. Blackstone, I'll be honest with you. Given your husband's connections in this town and the resources at his disposal, this is going to be an uphill battle. Are you prepared for what that means?" I wasn't, but I told her I was anyway. That evening, Adrien returned home at his usual time, 6:30 p.m. sharp, just like he had every weekday for the past 5 years. Except now I knew he hadn't been at the office all day. Now I knew that somewhere between his morning meetings and evening return, he'd been with Natasha Sterling, probably celebrating their future together while I scheduled cancer treatments. He found me in the living room, sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, a stack of legal documents spread across the coffee table in front of me. When he saw the papers, his expression shifted from wary to annoyed. "Victoria, what is this?" "Your divorce," I said calmly, not looking up from the asset disclosure forms Maria had given me to complete. "You said you wanted it to be simple and clean. I'm just doing my part." Adrien picked up one of the documents, his frown deepening as he read. "You hired Maria Santos?" "Victoria, that's completely unnecessary. We can handle this amicably, between ourselves." Amicably? I finally looked up at him, this man who'd shared my bed for 5 years, and apparently found it so unbearable he'd been seeking comfort elsewhere for 8 months. "Adrien, you're divorcing me 3 days after I was diagnosed with cancer so you can marry your secretary. I'm not sure we have the same definition of amicable." "Natasha isn't just my secretary," he snapped, and I had to admire his honesty, even if it felt like a knife to the chest. She's important to me, Victoria. This isn't some casual affair." "No, of course not. 8 months is practically a lifetime commitment." His jaw tightened. "Don't be sarcastic. It doesn't suit you." "You know what else doesn't suit me, Adrien?" "Cancer. But here we are, dealing with things that don't suit us." He set the papers down harder than necessary, his composure finally starting to crack. "Look, I know this timing seems harsh, but Victoria, we both know this marriage has been over for years. We've been roommates, not husband and wife. We barely even talk anymore." There it was, the justification I'd been waiting for. The way he'd rewrite our history to make himself the victim, to make our divorce seem like a mutual decision rather than his abandonment of a sick wife. We don't talk because every time I tried to talk to you, you were too tired or too busy or not in the mood, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. We don't talk because you started working late every night 8 months ago, coincidentally, right around the time you hired Natasha. That's not fair. Fair? I stood up so quickly that the papers scattered across the floor. Adrian, I have cancer. Stage 3 breast cancer. I need surgery in 2 weeks, followed by 6 months of chemotherapy that will make me sick, weak, and probably bald. And instead of a husband who will hold my hand through the worst experience of my life, I get divorce papers. But you're worried about what's fair? For a moment, just a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Adrien, the man who'd held my hair back when I had food poisoning, who'd promised to be my safe harbor in every storm. But then his expression hardened again, and I realized that man was gone. Maybe he'd been gone for years, and I'd just been too naive to notice. Victoria, I'll make sure you have the best medical care available. Money won't be an issue. I'll pay for everything. The treatments, the specialists, whatever you need. But I can't pretend to be something I'm not anymore. I can't fake feelings I don't have. Fake feelings. The words came out as a whisper. Is that what the last 5 years have been? Fake feelings? The last 2 years, at least, he said, and the casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Victoria, we're different people than we were when we got married. We want different things. You want Natasha. I want to be happy, he said, as if that explained everything. I want to wake up next to someone who excites me, who challenges me, who makes me feel alive. I want a partner, not a... He stopped himself, but I knew what he'd been about to say. Not a burden, I finished for him. Not a sick wife who's going to be expensive and exhausting and probably not very attractive after chemotherapy. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. Adrien ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing and now recognized as his tell when he was about to say something he knew was wrong. Victoria, Natasha and I, we're planning to get married. Soon. She's young, she's healthy, she wants children. She can give me things that I what, Adrien? That I can't give you because I'm sick? Because I might die? Because we're not compatible anymore, he exploded, finally showing the temper he'd been holding back. Because when I look at you, I don't see my future. I see obligation, responsibility, duty. I see everything I'll have to give up to take care of you through this illness. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Henderson calling for her dog, the sound of normal life continuing while mine imploded. There it is, I said quietly, the truth. Adrian's face was flushed, his breathing heavy, like he'd just run a marathon. Victoria, I didn't mean... Yes, you did. You meant every word. I bent down and began gathering the scattered papers, my hands surprisingly steady. You know what, Adrien? You're right about one thing. We are different people than we were when we got married. The man I married would never abandon his wife when she needed him most. The man I married understood that in sickness and in health wasn't just a pretty phrase in our wedding vows. People change, Victoria. Yes, they do. I straightened up, clutching the legal documents to my chest like armor. They either become better versions of themselves when tested, or they reveal who they really were all along. What's that supposed to mean? I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than pain and betrayal. I felt pity. It means I'm glad I found out now what kind of man you are, rather than wasting any more years believing you were someone else. Adrien stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't going to go the way he'd planned. Then I wasn't going to quietly disappear so he could start his new life with Natasha without any inconvenient guilt. Fine, he said finally. If that's how you want to play this, fine. But Victoria, I have resources you can't even imagine. I have connections, influence, the best lawyers money can buy. If you want to make this difficult, I can make it impossible. And there it was, the threat I'd been expecting. The moment Adrian Blackstone stopped pretending to be the victim and revealed himself as the predator he'd always been in business. He'd just made the mistake of treating me like one of his competitors. Is that a threat, Adrian? It's a reality check. You can't win against me. I smiled then, the same cold smile I'd given him in the kitchen that morning, and watched him take an involuntary step backward. Watch me. Adrian's war against me began the very next morning, and it was more systematic and ruthless than I could have imagined. The first strike came at 7:23 a.m., when my bank card was declined at the pharmacy where I was picking up pre-surgery medications. The pharmacist, Mrs. Chen, looked as confused as I felt when the transaction failed 3 times in a row. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackstone," she said apologetically. "It says here that this account has been frozen pending legal review. Do you have another form of payment?" I didn't. Adrian and I had always shared our finances. Joint checking, joint savings, joint credit cards. Everything was connected, and apparently, everything was now frozen. I stood there in the fluorescent lighting of Millbrook Pharmacy, holding a bottle of anti-nausea medication that cost $347, with a line of people behind me and no way to pay for the drugs I'd need for my surgery in 10 days. I'll have to come back," I managed, my face burning with embarrassment as I handed the medication back to Mrs. Chen. The second strike came an hour later, when I tried to call my oncologist's office to discuss the surgery timeline. Dr. Martinez's receptionist, usually warm and efficient, sounded uncomfortable when she came back on the line. "Mrs. Blackstone, I'm showing here that your insurance has been, well, there seems to be some question about your coverage. The insurance company received a call this morning indicating that you might not be eligible for spousal benefits much longer. They're requesting additional documentation before approving your surgery." My surgery. The surgery that needed to happen within 2 weeks or my cancer could progress beyond treatability. Adrien had found a way to weaponize my medical care. I spent the rest of that day on the phone with insurance representatives, bank managers, and anyone else who might be able to explain how my entire financial life had been dismantled overnight. The answers were always the same: pending legal proceedings, spousal disputes, nothing they could do without court orders. By the time Maria Santos called me back that evening, I was sitting in my kitchen, our kitchen, with a stack of bills I couldn't pay and a surgery I couldn't afford. "Victoria, I've never seen anything quite like this," Maria said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Your husband has filed emergency motions claiming that you're mentally unstable due to your illness and that you pose a financial risk to the marital assets. He's convinced a judge to freeze everything until a psychiatric evaluation can be completed." "Mentally unstable?" The words came out as a croak. "He's claiming that your cancer diagnosis has caused you to make irrational decisions, including hiring an attorney against his wishes and refusing to accept his, quote, generous divorce settlement. His lawyer has painted this as a concerned husband trying to protect his sick wife from her own poor judgment." I wanted to laugh at the audacity of it, but I was too exhausted. "How long until the evaluation?" 3 weeks, minimum. Maybe longer. 3 weeks. My surgery was scheduled for next Friday. Without insurance approval, the hospital bill would be close to $80,000, money I no longer had access to. But Adrien wasn't finished. The next morning, I woke up to find a moving truck in my driveway. 2 men in uniform were loading furniture onto the truck while Adrien stood on the front lawn, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like a general commanding troops. I ran outside in my bathrobe, my hair still tangled from sleep. "What are you doing? You can't just take our furniture." "Actually, I can," Adrien said without looking at me. "Everything in this house was purchased with my money, most of it before we were married. I have receipts, credit card statements, proof of ownership. My attorney advised me to secure my assets before they could be damaged or destroyed." I watched helplessly as they loaded our dining room table, the one we'd chosen together for our first Christmas in this house. The sectional sofa where we'd spend countless evenings watching movies. The king-size bed where we'd made love and shared secrets and planned our future. "The bed too?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. I'm leaving you the guest room furniture, Adrian replied, finally meeting my eyes. And some basic kitchen items? I'm not unreasonable, Victoria. Not unreasonable. The man was taking our bed while I was facing cancer surgery, but he wasn't unreasonable. Mrs. Henderson appeared at her fence, her golden retriever panting beside her. Everything all right over there, Victoria? Everything's fine, Adrian called out before I could answer. Just some temporary arrangements while my wife focuses on her health. The way he said it, like he was being noble, like this was all for my benefit, made my stomach turn. But worse than Adrian's performance was the look of pity and confusion on Mrs. Henderson's face. She'd known us for 3 years, had watched us plant our garden and host barbecues and play with her dog in our backyard. Now she was watching our marriage dissolve in the most public way possible. The campaign of humiliation continued throughout the week. Adrien had always been well connected in Millbrook Heights. He'd built homes for half the town's elite and donated generously to local charities. Now he was using those connections to systematically isolate me. My hair appointment was mysteriously canceled. The salon owner, Rebecca Walsh, claimed there had been a, quote, scheduling conflict, but when I drove by later that day, I could see her working on another client in the chair that should have been mine. The grocery store where I'd shopped for years suddenly couldn't approve my credit. The country club, where Adrien and I had been members since our wedding, sent a letter explaining that my membership had been, quote, temporarily suspended pending resolution of administrative issues. Even my gym membership was revoked. 24 hours after Adrian's threats, I was essentially persona non grata in my own town. But the cruelest blow came on Thursday evening, when I received a call from my former boss at Henderson and Associates. Victoria, I'm so sorry to bother you during this difficult time, Patricia Henderson said, her voice carefully neutral. But I wanted to give you a heads up. Adrien came by the office today with some concerns about the consulting work you've been doing for us since you left. My part-time consulting work was the only income I had that wasn't tied to Adrien. For the past 2 years, I'd been helping Henderson and Associates with their marketing campaigns, work that brought in about $30,000 annually. Not enough to live on, but enough to maintain some independence. What kind of concerns? I asked, though I already knew. He's suggesting that the stress of your illness might be affecting the quality of your work. He mentioned that you've been emotional lately, unpredictable. He's worried that associating with you might damage our firm's reputation, especially given the marital difficulties. The careful way she spoke told me everything I needed to know. Adrien had threatened Henderson and Associates, probably threatened their business relationship with Blackstone Development, which was worth 10 times what my consulting brought in. I understand, I said quietly. Victoria, if there was any other way. I understand, I repeated, and hung up before Patricia could offer any more meaningless apologies. By Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Adrien had asked for a divorce, I was sitting in an empty house with no income, no access to my money, no insurance approval for surgery, and no allies left in the town where I'd lived for 5 years. I should have been broken. Adrien had calculated this perfectly. Sick wife, no resources, no support system, no way to fight back. He'd probably expected me to come crawling back, to accept whatever settlement he offered just to survive. Instead, I did something that would have surprised the old Victoria, the woman who'd tried so hard to be the perfect wife that she'd lost herself completely. I called Maria Santos. Maria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. In your professional opinion, can we win this? Really win, not just survive it? There was a pause before she answered. Victoria, your husband has made some very serious mistakes this week. Financial abuse, insurance manipulation, using his business connections to destroy your livelihood. It's all documented. If we can prove a pattern of deliberate cruelty, that's not what I asked. Can we win? Against Adrien Blackstone? With his money and connections. Another pause. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. And it won't be pretty. But can we win? Yes, Maria said finally. if you're willing to fight dirty." I smiled for the first time in a week. "Maria, you have no idea how dirty I'm willing to fight." The confrontation that would change everything happened at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in the most unlikely place imaginable, the oncology wing of Riverside General Hospital. I was sitting in Dr. Martinez's waiting room, clutching a folder full of legal documents that Maria had helped me prepare over the weekend. We'd worked 18-hour days to build a case for emergency relief, documenting every one of Adrian's financial manipulations, every canceled service, every deliberate attempt to sabotage my medical care. The folder represented our Hail Mary, a petition to the court for immediate access to funds for my surgery, which was now just 4 days away. The insurance company had finally approved my procedure that morning, but only after Maria threatened them with a lawsuit for discrimination based on marital status. Even so, I'd need to pay a $15,000 deductible up front, money that remained frozen in accounts I couldn't touch. I was reviewing Maria's notes when I heard a familiar laugh echoing down the hallway. My blood turned to ice. That laugh had once been my favorite sound in the world, warm and genuine and full of joy. Now it felt like nails on a chalkboard. Adrien appeared around the corner, his arm wrapped around a petite blonde woman who couldn't have been older than 25. She was beautiful in that effortless way that comes with youth. Clear skin, bright eyes, the kind of natural glow that no amount of expensive skincare could replicate. Her designer dress probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the engagement ring on her finger was easily 3 carats. Natasha Sterling, in the flesh. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't notice me at first. Adrien was looking at her with the same expression he'd once reserved for me, like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever met, like every word she spoke was pure gold. "The appointment shouldn't take long," he was saying, his hand resting protectively on her lower back. "Dr. Pemberton just wants to do the final consultation before we start trying. For babies." Adrien was taking his mistress to a fertility specialist, while his wife sat 20 feet away, waiting for cancer surgery. That's when Natasha spotted me. Her step faltered, and she whispered something to Adrien that made him look up sharply. When our eyes met across the waiting room, I saw a flash of something. Guilt, maybe, or embarrassment, before his expression hardened into the cold mask I'd become accustomed to. He walked over to me, with Natasha clinging to his arm like a beautiful accessory. The other patients in the waiting room, people dealing with their own medical crises, turned to watch this domestic drama unfold in real time. "Victoria," Adrien said, his voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" "Having cancer," I replied flatly. "What are you doing here?" I could see Natasha's grip tighten on Adrien's arm. Up close, she was even more stunning. The kind of woman who probably never had a bad photo taken, never woke up with bedhead, never looked anything less than perfect. She was everything I used to be before stress and fear and betrayal had carved lines around my eyes and stolen the color from my cheeks. "This is Natasha," Adrien said, as if introducing his fiancée to his soon-to-be ex-wife in a cancer center was perfectly normal behavior. "The assistant," I said, not bothering to hide my contempt. "Former assistant," Natasha corrected, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so young. "I resigned last month to focus on planning our wedding. Our wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow. They were planning their wedding while my divorce wasn't even finalized, while I was fighting for access to my own money to pay for life-saving surgery. "How romantic," I said. "Planning your future while I'm fighting for mine." Adrien's jaw tightened. "Victoria, don't cause a scene." "A scene?" I stood up slowly, the legal documents clutched in my hand. "Adrien, you froze my bank accounts, took my furniture, destroyed my credit, cost me my job, and blocked my medical insurance. You've systematically dismantled my entire life in less than 2 weeks. And you're worried about me causing a scene?" "You're being dramatic again," he said, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. The other patients were openly staring now, and a nurse had appeared behind the reception desk, clearly prepared to intervene if necessary. "Dramatic?" I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm sitting in an oncology waiting room because I have cancer, Adrien. Stage 3 breast cancer. I need surgery in 4 days. Surgery I can't afford because you've locked me out of our joint accounts. How exactly is that dramatic? Natasha looked genuinely shocked, like she hadn't known the full extent of what Adrian had done. She turned to him with wide eyes. Adrian, you said she had access to money for her medical care. You said you were taking care of that. I am taking care of it, Adrian said quickly. The insurance approval came through this morning. After my attorney threatened to sue them, I interjected. And that doesn't cover the deductible, which you know perfectly well. Victoria, if you would just accept the settlement we offered. The settlement? I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You mean the settlement that gives me $50,000 to disappear quietly while you keep the house, the business, the investments, and everything else we built together? The settlement that assumes I'll be dead within a year anyway, so why waste money on a lengthy divorce? The waiting room had gone completely silent. Even the nurses had stopped what they were doing to listen. Adrian's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. That's not... You're twisting everything, he stammered. Am I? I pulled out one of the documents from my folder and held it up. This is the psychiatric evaluation you demanded, Adrian. The one where you claimed I was mentally unstable due to my illness. The one designed to delay court proceedings until after my surgery, when I'll presumably be too weak from chemotherapy to fight back effectively. Natasha stepped away from Adrian slightly, her perfect composure finally cracking. What is she talking about? It's a standard legal procedure, Adrian said, but his voice lacked conviction. Standard? I laughed again, harsher this time. Natasha, did you know that your fiancé filed papers claiming I was psychologically unfit to manage my own affairs? Did you know he's trying to have me declared incompetent so he can control the divorce proceedings? That's enough, Adrian exploded, his carefully maintained facade finally shattering completely. You want to know the truth, Victoria? Fine. Yes, I want this over with quickly. Yes, I want you to take the settlement and disappear, because looking at you is killing me. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The entire waiting room seemed to hold its breath. Looking at me is killing you, I repeated slowly. Yes, he shouted, past caring who heard him now. You want to know why I can't stand to be around you anymore? Because every time I see you, I see death. I see sickness and suffering and everything I don't want in my life. I see a future of hospitals and treatments and watching you waste away. I'm 34 years old, Victoria. I'm not ready to be a widower. Natasha gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Several other patients were openly crying. But I felt strangely calm, like Adrian had finally given me the honesty I'd been craving. There it is, I said quietly. The real reason. I want a life, Adrian continued, as if a dam had burst and he couldn't stop the words from pouring out. I want a wife who's healthy and beautiful and can give me children. I want to travel and build our business and enjoy our money without the specter of cancer hanging over everything. I want Natasha, not some sick woman who's going to drain our resources and then die anyway. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see horror on the faces of strangers who were dealing with their own medical battles, people who understood exactly what Adrian was really saying. But it was Natasha who spoke first, her voice shaking with something that might have been discussed. Adrian, how could you say something like that? How could I what? He turned on her, his anger finding a new target. How could I be honest about what I want? How could I refuse to sacrifice my entire future for someone who's probably going to be dead in 2 years anyway? That's when I knew I had him. Adrian Blackstone, master manipulator and careful businessman, had just revealed his true nature in front of a room full of witnesses. More importantly, he'd revealed it in front of the woman he supposedly loved. Hey, Salsi. I looked at Natasha, who was staring at Adrian like she'd never seen him before. The perfect life she'd imagined with him was crumbling in real time, and she was smart enough to see it. Natasha, I said gently, do you really want to marry a man who would abandon his wife during cancer treatment? Because if you do, what happens when you get sick? What happens when you get older? or if you have complications during childbirth, or if life gets difficult in any way." "Shut up," Adrian snarled at me. "Don't you dare try to turn her against me." But it was too late. I could see the doubt in Natasha's eyes, the fear that she might be looking at her own future. She'd seen what Adrien was capable of when someone he'd once loved became inconvenient. "I think," I said, standing up and gathering my papers, "I need to call my attorney. We're going to need to revise our strategy." Adrien grabbed my arm as I walked past him, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. "You're not going to win this," he hissed. "I'll destroy you completely before I let you take what's mine." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face and smiled. "Adrien, you just destroyed yourself." The call came at 11:47 p.m. on the night before my surgery, just as I was trying to fall asleep on the narrow guest bed in what used to be my own home. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled me to answer. "Mrs. Blackstone, this is Natasha Sterling. I need to talk to you." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. The last time I'd seen her, she'd been staring at Adrien in horror as he revealed his true nature in that hospital waiting room. That had been 3 days ago, and I hadn't heard from either of them since. "It's late, Natasha, and I have surgery in the morning." "I know. That's why I'm calling." Her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying. "I have something you need to know. Something about Adrien that... God, I can't believe I was so stupid." 20 minutes later, Natasha Sterling was sitting in my nearly empty living room, looking nothing like the polished woman I'd met at the hospital. Her designer clothes had been replaced with jeans and a sweater, her perfect makeup was gone, and her 3-carat engagement ring was noticeably absent from her finger. "I broke up with him," she said without preamble. "After what happened at the hospital, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. About what happens when I get sick, or old, or inconvenient." I poured her a cup of tea from the mismatched set Adrien had left behind. "Apparently my grandmother's china wasn't valuable enough to steal. That must have been difficult." "It was the easiest decision I've ever made," she said, then looked up at me with eyes that were older than they'd been 3 days ago. "Victoria, there are things you don't know about Adrien, things I should have told someone a long time ago." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. "I worked for him for 2 years. I saw everything, the business deals, the personal accounts, the other women." "Other women?" "Before me, there was Rachel Morrison. She was his marketing director. Before her, it was Amanda Chen from the accounting firm that handles his books. Before Amanda, there was Jessica Walsh. She worked for the city planning department." Natasha's voice grew steadier as she spoke, like she was finding strength and finally telling the truth. "Victoria, you aren't the first wife he cheated on." The words hit me like a physical blow. "First wife?" "Adrien was married before he met you. Her name was Caroline Mitchell. They divorced in 2016, 2 years before you got together." Natasha pulled out a photograph and handed it to me. She was beautiful, successful, everything he said he wanted. Until she got lupus. I stared at the photo of a stunning redhead standing next to Adrien at what looked like a charity gala. She was laughing at something he'd said, and he was looking at her with the same adoring expression I remembered from our early days together. "Lupus," I repeated. "An autoimmune disease. Chronic, unpredictable, requiring ongoing medical care." Natasha's voice was bitter now. "Caroline fought him in court for 3 years. He used every dirty trick you can imagine. Froze her assets, questioned her mental competency, even tried to have her declared an unfit mother so he could get custody of their daughter." "Their daughter?" The room was spinning around me. "Emma. She's 12 now, lives with Caroline in Portland. Adrien hasn't seen her in over a year, not since Caroline got engaged to her rheumatologist." Natasha pulled out more documents. "He pays child support, but only because the court forced him to. Caroline had to take him back to court twice when he tried to reduce the payments by claiming business losses." I set down my teacup with shaking hands. How do you know all this? Because I helped him hide it from you. The shame in her voice was unmistakable. When you two got engaged, Adrian was terrified you'd find out about Caroline and Emma. He made me create fake financial documents, false employment records, anything that would erase evidence of his first marriage. He even had his lawyers threaten Caroline with harassment charges if she ever tried to contact you. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Adrian's mysterious business trips that I'd never been allowed to join. His reluctance to talk about his past. The way he'd always deflected questions about family or previous relationships. But that's not the worst part, Natasha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Victoria, I think he's done this before. I think he specifically targets women who are vulnerable, who don't have family or strong support systems. Women who would be easy to isolate and control. She handed me another set of documents. These are bank records from his personal accounts. Look at the dates. I scanned the papers, my vision blurring as the implications became clear. Large cash withdrawals, always around the time his relationships ended. Payments to private investigators. Retainer fees to multiple law firms across the state. He's been planning this for months, I realized. Maybe longer. The psychiatric evaluation, the frozen accounts, even hiring me as his assistant. It was all calculated. Natasha's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. Look at this. She showed me a series of text messages between her and Adrien, dating back to my cancer diagnosis. My blood turned to ice as I read them. Adrien, the cancer thing is actually perfect timing. Gives us grounds for mental incompetency if she fights the settlement. Natasha, that seems cruel, even for you. Adrien, business is business, sweetheart. She'll be dead in 2 years anyway. Better to cut our losses now. Natasha, what if she doesn't accept the settlement? Adrien, then we make her life so miserable she has no choice. I've done this dance before. I looked up at Natasha, who was crying silently. Why are you showing me this? Because what he said at the hospital. About you dying anyway. About not wanting to be a widower. I realized he was talking about me too. Someday, when I get older or sick or just inconvenient, he'll do the same thing to me that he's doing to you. That he did to Caroline. She reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out what looked like a private investigator's report. This is what finally convinced me to leave him. I hired someone to look into his background after that scene at the hospital. Victoria, Adrien doesn't just have a pattern of abandoning sick wives, he has a pattern of making them sick. What do you mean? Caroline's lupus flare-ups always seemed to coincide with stress in their marriage. The doctors couldn't explain why her condition deteriorated so rapidly after they separated. Natasha's voice was barely audible now. And there were 2 other women, before Caroline. Both developed mysterious health issues after getting involved with Adrien. Both ended up broke and isolated after their relationships ended. The report contained medical records, police reports, and witness statements that painted a picture of a man who was far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Adrien wasn't just cruel. He was calculated, methodical, and possibly sociopathic. One of them, Rebecca Santos, tried to file charges against him for emotional abuse and financial manipulation, Natasha continued. But she died before the case went to court. Suicide, according to the coroner's report. But her sister has never believed it. I stared at the documents spread across my coffee table, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what I was learning. The man I'd married, the man I'd loved and trusted, wasn't just abandoning me during my illness. He was part of a pattern that might have killed other women. Why didn't you come forward before? I asked. Because I was in love with him, Natasha said simply. Or I thought I was. He has this way of making you feel like you're the only person in the world who matters, like you're special and chosen and perfect. Until you're not anymore. I understood exactly what she meant. I'd felt that intoxicating rush of being Adrian's everything, right up until the moment I became nothing. What changed your mind? You did. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. At the hospital, when he was saying those horrible things about you dying, about not wanting to be a widower, I saw my future. I saw myself at 35 or 40, maybe with a few kids, maybe dealing with postpartum depression or a difficult pregnancy. And I saw him looking at me the same way he was looking at you, like I was a burden he couldn't wait to get rid of. She stood up and gathered the documents back into the envelope. I'm leaving Millbrook Heights tomorrow. I have a job offer in Seattle, and I think it's time for a fresh start. But I wanted to give you this first. Evidence of what he's done, who he really is. Natasha, this could destroy him. Good, she said fiercely, because if we don't stop him now, he'll just find another vulnerable woman to prey on, and next time she might not be as strong as you are. After she left, I sat alone in my empty house, surrounded by evidence of my husband's true nature. Adrian Blackstone wasn't just a cheating husband or a selfish man afraid of illness. He was a predator who specifically targeted women in crisis, who systematically destroyed their lives and moved on to the next victim. The worst part was realizing how perfectly I'd fit his pattern. No family, no strong support system, a successful but not wealthy career that made me dependent on him financially. He'd probably been planning my destruction from the moment we got engaged. But Adrien had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that because I was sick, because I was isolated, because I was afraid, I would be easy to break. Nuh-uh. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I made the decision that would change everything while lying on a gurney at 6:30 a.m., waiting to be wheeled into surgery. The anesthesia hadn't been administered yet, but the pre-op medications had left me floating in that strange space between consciousness and dreams, where the most important choices of your life suddenly become crystal clear. Maria Santos was standing beside my bed, clipboard in hand, having arrived at the hospital before dawn to review our legal strategy one final time. The envelope Natasha had given me was tucked safely in Maria's briefcase, dozens of documents that could destroy Adrian's reputation, his business, and possibly his freedom. Victoria, we need to make a decision, Maria said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear us. The evidence Natasha provided is explosive. If we release it strategically, we can not only win your divorce case, but potentially trigger criminal investigations into Adrian's past relationships. The financial fraud alone could put him in prison for years. I stared up at the fluorescent lights, thinking about Caroline Mitchell living in Portland with lupus and a 12-year-old daughter who barely remembered her father. About Rebecca Santos, who died before she could see justice. About all the women who might come after me if Adrien was allowed to continue his pattern. But I was also thinking about what this kind of war would cost me. The media attention, the public scrutiny, the months or years of legal battles while I was fighting cancer. The energy I'd need for chemotherapy and recovery would be consumed by depositions and court appearances and character assassination attempts. What are our other options? I asked. We can use the evidence as leverage, Maria explained. Threaten to expose everything unless Adrien agrees to a fair settlement. He gets to keep his reputation and his freedom, and you get enough money to ensure your medical care and financial security for life. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that would let me focus on surviving cancer rather than destroying the man who'd betrayed me. But as I lay there in my hospital gown, waiting to have my breast removed by a surgeon I'd met only twice, I realized that survival meant more than just beating cancer. Maria, can I ask you something? Of course. In your professional opinion, if we let Adrien walk away from this with just a financial penalty, do you think he'll stop? Do you think he'll suddenly develop a conscience and stop preying on vulnerable women? Maria's expression told me everything I needed to know before she spoke. Victoria, in 20 years of family law, I've learned that men like Adrien don't change. They just get better at hiding what they do. A nurse appeared at my bedside, checking my IV and preparing to administer the medications that would put me under. In a few minutes, I'd be unconscious, trusting strangers to cut into my body and remove the cancer that was trying to kill me. When I woke up, I'd be forever changed, scarred, diminished, but hopefully alive. Mrs. Blackstone, we're ready for you, the anesthesiologist said, approaching with a syringe full of clear liquid. I looked up at Maria one last time. File everything. Release it all. I don't want his money. I want him stopped. Victoria, are you sure? Once we go down this path, there's no going back. Adrien will fight dirty, and it's going to get ugly. Maria, I'm about to have my breast removed because of cancer. Ugly is already here. I reached out and squeezed her hand. Promise me something. If I don't make it through this, through the surgery, through chemo, through whatever comes next, promise me you'll still pursue this case. Don't let him hurt anyone else. You're going to make it through this, Maria said firmly. And when you do, we're going to make sure Adrian Blackstone never hurts another woman again. The anesthesiologist injected the medication into my IV, and I felt the familiar floating sensation that precedes unconsciousness. My last coherent thought before the darkness took me was that I'd finally made a choice based on who I wanted to be, not who I thought I should be. I woke up 6 hours later to find Maria sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed, laptop open, phone pressed to her ear. She was in full attorney mode, and I could hear the controlled fury in her voice, even through the post-anesthesia haze. No, Mr. Hoffman, your client does not get to negotiate the terms of evidence release. Mrs. Blackstone has decided to pursue full disclosure, and we have every legal right to do so. She paused, listening to whatever Adrian's lawyer was saying on the other end. Yes, I'm aware of the implications for Mr. Blackstone's business. Perhaps he should have considered that before committing financial fraud and emotional abuse. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry from the breathing tube. Maria noticed I was awake and quickly ended her call. How do you feel? She asked, immediately switching from lawyer mode to friend mode. Like I've been hit by a truck, I croaked. But I'm alive. Surgery went perfectly. Dr. Martinez was able to remove all the cancerous tissue, and the lymph nodes looked clear. She's optimistic about your prognosis. That should have been the best news I'd received in weeks. But all I could think about was the battle ahead. What's Adrian's response? Maria's smile was sharp as a blade. Panic, mostly. Within 2 hours of us filing the documents with the court, he called offering to triple the settlement amount if we'd agree to seal the records. When I said no, he tried to have me disbarred for ethical violations. When that failed, he apparently threw such a tantrum in his lawyer's office that security had to escort him out. Despite the pain medication making everything fuzzy, I found myself smiling. He's scared, terrified, and he should be. Victoria. The evidence Natasha provided has triggered investigations by the State Attorney General's Office, the IRS, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Apparently, Adrian's pattern of behavior caught the attention of federal authorities who've been building a case against him for tax evasion and insurance fraud. The room was spinning slightly, but I forced myself to focus. What does that mean for us? It means you've done more than just protect yourself. You've potentially saved other women's lives. The FBI has been tracking a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances connected to wealthy men who prey on vulnerable women. Adrian's name has come up in at least 3 different investigations. I thought about Rebecca Santos, about Caroline Mitchell, about all the women whose names I'd never know who might have suffered at Adrian's hands. The decision I'd made in that pre-surgery haze suddenly felt like the most important choice of my life. There's something else, Maria continued, her voice gentler now. Natasha Sterling has agreed to testify against Adrien in exchange for immunity. She's also provided additional evidence that she'd been holding back, recordings of phone conversations, more financial documents, even security footage from Adrian's office showing him destroying records. She recorded him? Apparently, she started recording their conversations months ago, when she began to suspect he was manipulating her. Smart girl. Those recordings are going to be crucial evidence. A nurse came in to check my vitals and adjust my pain medication. As she worked, I stared out the hospital window at the gray October sky and thought about the choice I'd made. I could have taken the money and disappeared, could have focused solely on my health and let Adrien continue his pattern of abuse with other women. But lying there in that hospital bed, I realized that surviving cancer wasn't just about keeping my body alive. It was about keeping my soul intact. It was about being able to look at myself in the mirror and know that when I had the power to stop a predator, I chose to use it. Maria, I need you to do something else for me. Anything. I want you to contact Caroline Mitchell in Portland, and Rebecca Santos's sister, and any other women who might have been involved with Adrian. I want them to know they're not alone anymore and that they have the chance to get justice if they want it. Maria nodded, making notes on her tablet. Already working on it. Caroline's attorney has been trying to build a case against Adrien for years, but never had enough evidence. With what we have now, she might finally get the closure she deserves. As the pain medication began to take effect again, pulling me back towards sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not because the battle was over, but because I'd finally chosen to fight it on my own terms. Adrien had spent our entire marriage trying to make me smaller, weaker, more dependent on him. He'd counted on my fear and isolation to keep me under his control. But cancer had taught me something he'd never understood, that when you're fighting for your life, you discover exactly how strong you really are. And I was about to show him just how strong that was. The war against me began while I was still recovering from surgery, and it was more vicious than anything I could have imagined. It started with the flowers. Dozens of arrangements arrived at my hospital room within hours of Maria filing our evidence with the court. Beautiful, expensive bouquets that seemed like gestures of support until I read the cards. Hope you feel better soon, before it's too late. Thinking of you in your final days. Sorry for your loss, coming soon. Anonymous messages designed to look like well wishes while delivering psychological warfare. The nurses were horrified and immediately removed the arrangements, but the damage was done. Adrian's message was clear. He knew where I was, he had resources, and he wasn't going to fight fair. Dr. Martinez was the first to warn me about what was coming. She appeared at my bedside on the second day after surgery, her usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. Victoria, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it, she began, pulling the chair closer to my bed. I received a call this morning from the hospital's legal department. Someone has filed a complaint against me with the medical board, claiming I provided substandard care during your surgery and that I may have been influenced by your emotional state. The pain medication made it hard to focus, but I understood the implications immediately. Adrian's trying to discredit you. It's more than that. The complaint alleges that I was pressured into rushing your surgery to accommodate your legal timeline, and that I may have removed healthy tissue unnecessarily. Dr. Martinez's hands were shaking with rage. Victoria, this is my reputation, my career. The medical board has to investigate every complaint, no matter how frivolous. I struggled to sit up, ignoring the sharp pain in my chest. Dr. Martinez, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to be dragged into this. Don't apologize. This isn't your fault. It's the desperate act of a man who knows he's cornered. She leaned forward, her voice intense. But, Victoria, you need to understand what you're up against. If Adrien is willing to destroy a doctor's career to get at you, there's no limit to what he'll do. She was right. Over the next week, as I tried to recover from surgery while preparing for chemotherapy, Adrien's campaign of destruction reached new levels of creativity and cruelty. My insurance company received an anonymous tip that I was malingering, exaggerating my cancer diagnosis for financial gain. This triggered a review of my entire medical file and temporarily suspended my benefits, forcing Maria to file an emergency injunction just to ensure my chemotherapy wouldn't be delayed. The hospital parking garage became a hunting ground for reporters who'd somehow learned about my case. They ambushed anyone who visited me, twisting their words and publishing stories that painted me as a vindictive woman using her illness to destroy an innocent businessman. The headlines were brutal: cancer patient's revenge plot and dying woman's final act of spite. But the most devastating attack came through my medical team itself. Dr. Rodriguez, the oncologist who was supposed to oversee my chemotherapy, withdrew from my case after receiving what his office manager described as, quote, credible threats against his practice and family. The replacement they found was Dr. Wallace, an older physician whose bedside manner was as cold as his reputation. Mrs. Blackstone, Dr. Wallace said during our first consultation, barely looking up from his notes. "I want to be clear about something. Your case has become politically complicated. While I will provide you with adequate medical care, I cannot and will not be drawn into your legal battles." "I'm not asking you to be," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the exhaustion that seemed to permeate every cell in my body. "Good, because I've already received 3 calls from reporters asking about your prognosis and treatment plan. I will not be providing any statements about your case, positive or negative." The message was clear. Adrian had turned my cancer treatment into a public relations nightmare, and even my own doctors were afraid to be associated with me. The harassment extended beyond the medical realm. My few remaining friends began receiving visits from private investigators, asking probing questions about my mental health, my marriage, my history of vindictive behavior. Sarah Chen, my closest friend from college who lived in California, called me in tears after a man showed up at her workplace, claiming to be researching, quote, "patterns of false allegations in divorce cases." "Victoria, they're trying to make everyone afraid to support you," she sobbed over the phone. "The investigator told my boss that I might be called as a character witness in a high-profile legal case, and now my job is asking me to take unpaid leave until this situation resolves itself." Even Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who'd always been kind to me, stopped her morning walks past my house. When I finally saw her in the grocery store, she could barely meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, dear," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "But my son says I shouldn't be seen talking to you right now. Something about lawsuits and property values. I hope you understand." I did understand. Adrian wasn't just trying to destroy me. He was poisoning everyone around me, turning my support system against me through fear and manipulation. The psychological warfare reached its peak when I returned home from the hospital. Someone had vandalized my house, not with spray paint or broken windows, but with something much more sinister. Every plant in my garden, the garden Adrian and I had planned together during happier times, had been destroyed. Not trampled or uprooted, but carefully poisoned. The roses, the hydrangeas, the vegetable patch where I'd dreamed of growing tomatoes for our future children, everything was dead, turned brown and withered in a matter of days. A note was taped to my front door. "Gardens need constant care to survive. Neglect them, and they die, just like everything else." I stood in my driveway, staring at the devastation, and felt something break inside me. Not my resolve, that had only gotten stronger, but my last lingering attachment to the woman I used to be. The woman who'd believed in fairness, who'd thought that doing the right thing would be rewarded, who'd trusted that good would triumph over evil simply because it was good. That woman was as dead as my garden. Maria found me there an hour later, still standing among the poisoned plants, holding the threatening note. "Victoria, we need to file for a restraining order immediately," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "This has gone beyond legal hardball. This is stalking and intimidation." "Will it work?" I asked, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. "Probably not. Adrian's too smart to leave direct evidence linking him to any of this. But it will create a paper trail, document the pattern of harassment." I looked at her then, this woman who'd become more than my attorney, who'd become my ally in a war I'd never asked to fight. "Maria, are you having second thoughts about this case? About representing me?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her words carefully. "Victoria, I'm going to be honest with you. This case has already cost me 3 clients who were afraid of being associated with someone fighting Adrian Blackstone. My law partner thinks I'm risking the entire practice by taking you on." My heart sank. If I lost Maria, I'd have no one left to fight for me. "But," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I've been a family lawyer for 20 years, and I've never seen evidence of abuse this systematic, this calculated. What Adrien has done to you, what he's apparently done to other women, it's not just criminal, it's evil. And I didn't become a lawyer to let evil win, because it has better resources." She knelt down beside me among the dead plants, her expensive suit getting dirty on the poisoned soil. So no, I'm not having second thoughts. If anything, I'm more determined than ever to see this through. But Victoria, I need you to understand. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Adrian is just getting started. I looked around at the destruction, at the evidence of how far my husband was willing to go to silence me, and realized that Maria was right. This wasn't a legal battle anymore. It was total war. Good, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. Let him bring everything he has. I'm not the same woman he married, and I'm sure as hell not the same woman he tried to destroy. As we walked back toward the house, stepping carefully around the poisoned remnants of my former life, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my diagnosis. Anticipation. Not fear of what was coming, but excitement about fighting back. Adrian Blackstone had spent months underestimating me, assuming that cancer and isolation would make me weak and compliant. He was about to learn the difference between being broken and being forged into something stronger. The vindication came not with a dramatic courtroom revelation, but with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into my chemotherapy treatments. I was awake anyway. The steroids they gave me with the chemo made sleep impossible when Maria's ringtone cut through the silence of my empty house. Her voice was electric with exhaustion and triumph. Victoria, turn on Channel 7 News. Now. I fumbled for the remote, my hands still shaky from the latest round of treatment. The screen flickered to life just as the late-night anchor was introducing a breaking news segment. Tonight at 11, an explosive investigation into real estate mogul Adrian Blackstone reveals a pattern of alleged fraud, abuse, and potential murder spanning over a decade. Channel 7's investigative team has obtained exclusive documents and testimony that paint a picture of systematic criminal behavior. My heart stopped as Adrian's photograph filled the screen. Not his usual polished headshot, but a grainy image that looked like it had been taken from surveillance footage. He looked haggard, desperate, nothing like the confident businessman he'd always projected. The investigation began, the anchor continued, when federal authorities received evidence from Blackstone's estranged wife, Victoria Ashford Blackstone, who is currently battling cancer while fighting for her life in divorce court. The camera cut to footage of me leaving the hospital after one of my chemo sessions, looking pale and fragile but walking with determination. I barely recognized myself. When did I become this person? This fighter? But tonight, Mrs. Blackstone's allegations have been corroborated by a federal task force that has been quietly investigating Blackstone for the past 18 months. Maria's voice crackled through the phone. Victoria, are you watching? How did this happen so fast? It didn't. The FBI has been building a case against Adrien since before you even filed for divorce. Your evidence was the final piece they needed, but they've been tracking him for years. On screen, the reporter was interviewing FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who spoke with the measured authority of someone who'd spent years pursuing complex financial crimes. Mr. Blackstone's pattern of behavior extends far beyond divorce proceedings, Agent Walsh was saying. We've identified at least 7 women over the past 12 years who have suffered similar experiences: financial manipulation, emotional abuse, and in some cases, suspicious circumstances surrounding their deaths or disappearances. 7 women. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known about Caroline and Rebecca, but 5 others? How many lives had Adrien destroyed while I was naively believing he loved me? The report continued with a devastating timeline. In 2011, Adrien had been briefly married to a woman named Lisa Fernandez, who died in a car accident just days after filing for divorce. The police had ruled it an accident, but the FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence that Adrien had tampered with her vehicle's brake lines. In 2014, his relationship with Jennifer Morrison, a successful architect, had ended when she'd suffered a mysterious poisoning that had left her with permanent neurological damage. She'd been too sick to pursue legal action, and Adrien had walked away from their shared business partnership with complete control of their multi-million-dollar development projects. The pattern is consistent, Agent Walsh explained to the camera. Mr. Blackstone targets successful, independent women who have assets he wants or knowledge he needs. He isolates them from their support systems, gains control of their finances, and when they become inconvenient, either through illness, legal challenges, or simply age, he eliminates them. Eliminates them? The clinical term made my skin crawl. But the most damaging revelation came when the reporter introduced Natasha Sterling, who appeared on camera with her face partially obscured but her voice clear and strong. Adrien didn't just abandon his wife during her cancer treatment, Natasha said, her words precise and devastating. He actively sabotaged her medical care. I have recordings of him calling her insurance company, claiming she was exaggerating her symptoms for attention. I have video footage of him putting something in her food on multiple occasions, something that made her nausea and fatigue worse than the cancer alone would have caused. The room spun around me as the implications sank in. Those weeks before my diagnosis, when I'd felt inexplicably weak and sick, when I'd attributed my symptoms to stress. Adrien had been poisoning me, making me sicker, more dependent, easier to control. I also have evidence, Natasha continued, that Adrien was planning Mrs. Blackstone's death to look like a suicide brought on by her illness. He had already prepared a note in her handwriting, had researched the most effective methods, and had begun moving their shared assets into accounts she couldn't access. My phone was buzzing with calls. Maria, reporters, people I hadn't heard from in months. But I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the horrible realization that Adrien hadn't just been planning to divorce me, he'd been planning to kill me. The news report shifted to show federal agents arresting Adrien outside his office building. The footage was from earlier that day, but I was seeing it for the first time. Adrien looked smaller somehow. Diminished, his usual confidence replaced by the wild-eyed panic of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. Adrien Blackstone has been charged with attempted murder, financial fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy in connection with the deaths of 2 former partners, the anchor announced. If convicted on all charges, he faces life in prison without possibility of parole. The camera cut to a press conference where District Attorney Michael Torres was speaking to a crowd of reporters. This case represents one of the most sophisticated patterns of domestic terrorism we've ever prosecuted, he said. Mr. Blackstone didn't just abuse his partners. He systematically hunted vulnerable women, exploited their trust, and when they were no longer useful to him, he eliminated them. Domestic terrorism. The phrase felt both too dramatic and not dramatic enough to describe what Adrien had done to me, to Caroline, to all the women whose names I was only now learning. My phone rang again, and this time I answered. Victoria, it's Agent Walsh from the FBI. I know this is overwhelming, but we need to talk. There are things about your case that we haven't made public yet. Evidence that could help us prosecute not just Adrien, but the network of people who helped him. Network? Mrs. Blackstone, your husband didn't operate alone. The private investigators who harassed your friends, the doctors who withdrew from your case, the lawyers who tried to have your attorney disbarred, many of them were part of a coordinated conspiracy. We're talking about dozens of people who knew what Adrien was doing and helped him do it. The scope of it was staggering. Adrien hadn't just been a man having a midlife crisis, or even a garden-variety sociopath. He'd been the center of a criminal enterprise designed to prey on women and steal their assets. But here's what I need you to understand, Agent Walsh continued. Your decision to fight back, to release that evidence, despite the personal cost, it didn't just save your own life. It's given us the tools to bring down an entire network of predators who have been operating with impunity for over a decade. After I hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the detritus of my destroyed life, the few pieces of furniture Adrien had left behind, the medical equipment I needed for my chemo treatments, the legal documents that had consumed my existence for months. But For the first time since my diagnosis, I didn't feel like a victim. The vindication wasn't just about proving I'd been right about Adrian's cruelty. It was about discovering that my choice to fight, despite being sick and isolated and afraid, had stopped a serial killer. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Blackstone, this is Caroline Mitchell. I saw the news. Thank you for having the courage I couldn't find. Because of you, my daughter will grow up knowing her father can't hurt anyone else. I hope you beat this cancer with the same strength you showed in beating him." I read the message 3 times before the tears came. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Tomorrow, I would wake up and continue fighting cancer. I would endure more chemotherapy, more nausea, more uncertainty about my future. But I would do it knowing that I'd used my limited time and energy to stop a monster. To save women whose names I might never know. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I thought about something Dr. Martinez had said during one of my first appointments. Cancer teaches you what really matters. It strips away everything non-essential and shows you who you really are. She'd been right. Cancer had shown me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, braver than I'd ever been, and more capable of fighting for what was right than I'd ever believed possible. And now the whole world knew it too. The collapse of Adrian's empire happened faster than anyone had anticipated. Like a controlled demolition, where every support beam gave way in perfect sequence. Within 48 hours of his arrest, Blackstone Development was placed under federal receivership as investigators worked to untangle which assets had been legitimately earned and which had been obtained through criminal activity. The company's stock price plummeted from $47 per share to $3.50 in a single trading day, wiping out millions in value and triggering a cascade of lawsuits from investors who claimed they'd been defrauded. But the most satisfying consequence came when the very people who'd helped Adrien terrorize me began facing their own reckonings. Gerald Hoffman, the attorney who'd refused to represent me and had spent weeks filing frivolous motions on Adrian's behalf, was suspended from practicing law pending an ethics investigation. The state bar had received evidence that he'd knowingly participated in a conspiracy to defraud the court and obstruct justice. Dr. Wallace, the oncologist who'd replaced Dr. Rodriguez and treated me with such cold disdain, found himself under investigation by the medical board after recordings surfaced of him discussing my case with Adrian's legal team, a violation of patient confidentiality that could cost him his license. The private investigators who'd harassed my friends were arrested on charges of stalking and witness intimidation. The reporters who'd published hit pieces about me were facing lawsuits from their own news organizations, who were scrambling to distance themselves from what was increasingly being called one of the most successful criminal conspiracies in recent memory. Even Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor who'd stopped speaking to me on her son's advice, appeared at my door 3 days after Adrian's arrest, with a homemade casserole and tears in her eyes. "Victoria, dear, I'm so ashamed of how I treated you," she said, wringing her hands as she stood on my front porch. "My son works in real estate, and he was terrified that associating with you would hurt his business. But after seeing the news, after learning what that monster was really doing," she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. "I invited her in for tea, and we sat in my nearly empty living room while she apologized for abandoning me when I'd needed support most." "You don't need to apologize," I told her, though her words meant more to me than she could know. "Adrien was very good at making people afraid. That was his power." "But you weren't afraid," she said, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to understand a foreign language. "Even when everyone turned against you, even when you were sick and alone, you kept fighting. How?" It was a question I'd been asking myself as well. How had I found the strength to fight back when everything in my life was falling apart? The answer, when it came to me, was simpler than I'd expected. Because the alternative was letting him win, I said. And if he won, it meant that other women would suffer the way I did. I couldn't live with that. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, then reached across and squeezed my hand. "You're a hero, Victoria. I hope you know that." Hero. The word felt strange, foreign. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a woman who'd been forced to make impossible choices and had somehow chosen correctly. But as the days passed and more people reached out to me, I began to understand what Mrs. Henderson meant. Caroline Mitchell flew in from Portland with her daughter Emma, a beautiful, serious 12-year-old who looked nothing like Adrian and everything like her strong, resilient mother. Caroline had been cancer-free for 2 years now, but the stress of dealing with Adrian's harassment had taken its toll. She was thin, prematurely gray, and carried herself with the careful movements of someone who'd learned not to trust the world. "I wanted Emma to meet you," Carolyn said as we sat in my living room. "I wanted her to see what it looks like when someone stands up to a bully, even when it costs them everything." Emma had been quiet during most of their visit, but as they were preparing to leave, she approached me with the directness that only children possess. "My mom told me about my father," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, "about how he hurt people. She said you stopped him." "I helped stop him," I corrected gently, "but it took a lot of people working together." "Are you going to die?" she asked, and Caroline gasped at her daughter's bluntness. "Emma!" she scolded, but I held up a hand. "It's okay. Emma, I have cancer, and cancer is very serious. But I'm getting good treatment, and I'm fighting as hard as I can to get better." Emma nodded solemnly. "Good. Because there are probably other bad men out there, and you might need to stop them too." After they left, I sat alone with Emma's words echoing in my mind. There are probably other bad men out there. She was right, of course. Adrien hadn't been unique, he'd just been caught. How many other predators were operating with the same systematic cruelty, the same network of enablers, the same confidence that their victims would be too isolated and afraid to fight back? The answer came 2 weeks later when Agent Walsh called with an update on the federal investigation. "Victoria, we've had a breakthrough," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "The evidence you provided has given us access to Adrian's computers and financial records. We have identified similar patterns of behavior in at least 6 other major cities. This wasn't just Adrian, it was a nationwide network. The scope of it was staggering. Adrien had been part of what federal investigators were calling a, quote, predator franchise. Wealthy men who shared information about vulnerable targets, techniques for isolation and control, and even referrals for victims who moved between cities. We're talking about dozens of perpetrators and potentially hundreds of victims," Agent Walsh continued. "Women who thought they were dealing with individual bad relationships when actually they were being systematically hunted by an organized criminal enterprise. What does this mean for the prosecution? It means Adrien is looking at federal charges under the RICO Act, organized crime statutes that carry mandatory life sentences. It also means that your testimony will be crucial not just for his case, but for dismantling the entire network." The weight of it settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. I was still in the middle of chemotherapy, still fighting for my own life, and now I was being asked to help prosecute what amounted to a domestic terrorism organization. "Agent Walsh, I need you to be honest with me. How many more women could we save if I agree to testify?" "Conservatively, dozens. Possibly hundreds." "Then I'll do it." But the most unexpected redemption came from Natasha Sterling herself. She called me on a Thursday evening, just as I was finishing dinner and preparing for another night of chemo-induced insomnia. "Victoria, I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she began, her voice tentative and uncertain, "but I wanted to tell you that I've been accepted into the FBI training program at Quantico." I nearly dropped the phone. "The FBI?" Agent Walsh suggested it after seeing how I documented Adrian's crimes. She said I had good instincts for investigation and that the Bureau needs people who understand how predators like Adrien operate. Natasha paused, then continued in a stronger voice. "I want to spend my life stopping men like him. I want to make sure no other woman goes through what you went through, what Caroline went through, what I almost went through. It was perfect justice, in a way. The woman Adrien had groomed to be his next victim was going to dedicate her life to protecting other women from men like him. That's wonderful, Natasha. You'll make an excellent agent. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her voice grew serious. Do you forgive me? For my part in what Adrien did to you? I thought about it for a long moment, considering the question carefully. Did I forgive the young woman who'd unknowingly been part of a conspiracy to destroy my life? Who'd helped the man I loved betray me in the cruelest possible way? Natasha, you were as much his victim as I was, I said finally. You were just luckier. You figured out what he was before it was too late to escape. But you stopped him, even when it cost you everything. We stopped him, all of us together. After I hung up, I realized that for the first time in months I felt something approaching peace. Not because the fight was over. The legal battles would continue for years, and my cancer treatment still had months to go. But because I finally understood what Dr. Martinez had meant when she said cancer would show me who I really was. I wasn't just a woman who'd survived Adrian's betrayal or who'd beaten cancer. I was someone who'd found the strength to fight for others when I could barely fight for myself. I was someone who'd chosen justice over safety, courage over comfort, truth over peace. Looking around my empty house, the house Adrien had tried to steal from me, the house that now legally belonged entirely to me thanks to the federal asset forfeiture, I realized it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a beginning. 6 months after Adrian's sentencing, life in prison without the possibility of parole, I was standing in the garden behind my house, planting new roses where the poisoned ones had died. My hair had grown back, shorter and curlier than before, with streaks of silver that made me look older but somehow stronger. The chemotherapy was behind me, and while I would never be completely free from the fear of cancer's return, my latest scans had been clear. Dr. Martinez had pronounced me officially in remission just that morning, and as I knelt in the rich, dark soil, I found myself thinking about how different this moment was from anything I could have imagined a year ago. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. When I answered it, I found Agent Walsh standing on my porch with a young woman I didn't recognize, probably in her early 30s, with hollow eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to expect pain. Victoria, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Agent Walsh said. This is Rebecca Chen. She was involved with David Morrison, one of Adrian's associates we arrested last month. She asked if she could meet you. I invited them in, noting how Rebecca's eyes swept the room, taking in the simple furniture, the medical equipment I no longer needed stored in the corner, the framed newspaper clipping from the day Adrien was convicted. She looked like I had felt 8 months ago. Lost, damaged, unsure if she would survive what had been done to her. Mrs. Blackstone, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. Agent Walsh told me what you went through, what you did. I wanted to thank you. Please call me Victoria, and you don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. Her voice grew stronger. Because of your case, because of the evidence you provided, we were able to prove that David was part of the same network. He's going to prison for 30 years. Without your courage, he would have moved on to someone else. Rebecca's story was heartbreakingly familiar. A successful marketing executive who'd met David at a conference. A whirlwind romance that had quickly turned controlling, then abusive. When she tried to leave, she'd been hospitalized with what doctors had called a severe allergic reaction, but which prosecutors now believed was deliberate poisoning. The worst part, Rebecca continued, was that everyone told me I was overreacting, that David was a good man going through a difficult time, that I should be more understanding, more supportive. She looked directly at me then. Did people tell you that about Adrien? Every single person in my life, I confirmed, right up until they saw him for who he really was. How did you know to keep fighting? When everyone was against you, when you were sick, when it would have been so much easier to just give up? It was the question I'd been asked dozens of times over the past months, by reporters, by other survivors, by federal prosecutors preparing their cases. The answer had taken me a long time to understand, but sitting there with Rebecca, I finally found the words. I didn't know if I would win, I said slowly. I didn't even know if I would survive. But I knew that if I didn't fight, if I let Adrien destroy me quietly, then every woman who came after me would face the same choice. And maybe some of them wouldn't be as lucky as I was. Maybe some of them wouldn't have a Maria Santos willing to take the risk, or a Natasha Sterling brave enough to come forward. Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, all the times I should have left earlier. Rebecca, listen to me very carefully. I leaned forward, making sure she could see the conviction in my eyes. There is no shame in being deceived by a professional deceiver. These men, Adrian, David, all of them, they're experts at manipulation. They study their victims. They learn exactly what to say and do to gain trust. You didn't miss signs. You encountered a master predator who was very good at his job. Agent Walsh spoke up. Victoria's right. We've interviewed dozens of victims across 7 states, and the pattern is always the same. These men don't target weak women. They target strong, successful women who have something they want. They break them down systematically, using techniques that would fool anyone. But some women do escape earlier, Rebecca protested. Some women see through it. Some women get lucky, I corrected, or they have different circumstances, different support systems, different timing. Rebecca, the only difference between us and the women who didn't survive is chance. We happen to find the strength to fight at the right moment, with the right help. That doesn't make us better than anyone else. After Rebecca and Agent Walsh left, I returned to my garden, thinking about the conversation and about all the women I'd met over the past months. Survivors like Caroline and Rebecca, whose lives had been shattered but who were slowly rebuilding. Families of victims who hadn't survived, who found some comfort in knowing their daughters and sisters hadn't died in vain. The federal investigation had ultimately identified 247 women who'd been targeted by the network, spanning 12 years and 8 states. 43 of them were dead, their deaths previously classified as suicides, accidents, or natural causes. The survivors ranged in age from 22 to 58, came from every profession imaginable, and had one thing in common. They'd all been strong, independent women who'd posed some kind of threat to the men who'd targeted them. The scope of it still took my breath away sometimes. A criminal enterprise that had operated for over a decade, destroying hundreds of lives, while their community pillars, respected businessmen, charitable donors. The banality of evil, one prosecutor had called it monsters who looked like everyone else. But if the investigation had taught me anything, it was that evil only succeeds when good people choose comfort over courage, when they decide that someone else's suffering isn't their responsibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma Mitchell, Caroline's daughter, who is now 13 and had become something of a pen pal. Victoria, I got into the youth leadership program at school. I'm going to learn about standing up to bullies just like you taught me. I smiled, remembering the serious 12-year-old who'd asked me if I was going to die, who'd understood instinctively that there were other bad men out there who needed to be stopped. Emma was going to be formidable someday, a force for justice in a world that desperately needed more people willing to fight. That evening, I attended a support group meeting for domestic violence survivors, something I'd started going to, not because I needed the support anymore, but because I'd learned that healing wasn't just about recovering from trauma. It was about using that experience to help others navigate their own darkness. Tonight's group included 3 new women, all in various stages of recognizing and escaping abusive relationships. As they shared their stories, I heard echoes of my own journey, the confusion, the self-doubt, the desperate hope that their partners would change. The hardest part, said Maria Santos, a different Maria than my attorney, a teacher whose husband had been gradually isolating her from friends and family, is that everyone keeps telling me he loves me, that love looks different for different people, that I should be patient. Love doesn't look like control, I said gently. Love doesn't look like isolation or fear or walking on eggshells. Real love wants you to be happy, healthy, and free to make your own choices. But what if I'm wrong? She asked. What if I leave and I regret it? Then you leave anyway, I said. Because Maria, the worst-case scenario of leaving someone who actually loves you is that you hurt their feelings and have to apologize. The worst-case scenario of staying with someone who doesn't love you is that you lose yourself completely. Or worse. After the meeting, as I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning when Adrian had asked for a divorce. The town that had once shunned me now treated me with a mixture of respect and awe that I found deeply uncomfortable. I'd become a symbol of something, courage, survival, justice, that felt larger than who I actually was. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps we all become symbols of something when we choose to act according to our deepest values, even when it costs us everything. Perhaps the most important lesson of my entire ordeal wasn't about marriage or cancer or even justice. Perhaps it was about the choice we all face every day. To be the person who looks away when someone is suffering, or to be the person who stands up and says, "Not on my watch." I'd learned that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling afraid and acting anyway. It's choosing to fight when fighting seems impossible. Choosing to speak when silence would be safer. Choosing to protect others when you can barely protect yourself. And I'd learned that sometimes, when you refuse to let evil win quietly, when you insist on dragging darkness into the light, you discover that you're not as alone as you thought, that there are others willing to stand with you, others waiting for someone brave enough to go first. As I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house that was finally, truly mine, I realized that Adrian's greatest failure hadn't been underestimating my strength. It had been believing that strength was about power over others, rather than power to protect others. He'd spent his life taking from women, diminishing them, using them up, and discarding them. But in the end, the women he'd tried to destroy had come together to destroy him. And in doing so, we discovered something he'd never understand. That real power isn't about what you can take from others, but about what you're willing to give up to protect them. That, I thought as I unlocked my front door and stepped into my quiet, peaceful home, was a lesson worth every battle I'd fought to learn it. The roses I'd planted that morning would bloom next spring, growing strong in soil that had once been poisoned but was now clean and fertile again. And every time I looked at them, I would remember that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the places where the worst damage was done. Sometimes the strongest people are forged in the fires of the worst betrayals. And sometimes choosing to fight when you have every reason to surrender is the most important decision you'll ever make, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.